Subscribe to The Honest Critique for current affairs, movie, book, and product reviews. Also, make sure you press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video. The views, information, or opinions expressed during the video series are solely those of the individuals and do not necessarily represent those of The Honest Critique and its employees. The following video contains strong language which may be offensive to some viewers. Viewer discretion advised.
So hello and welcome to a very special episode that we're recording in Afghanistan. And today we have among us Dr. Shanthie D'Souza. She is the founding professor at Kautilya School of Public Policy, founder of Mantraya, and the visiting faculty at Naval War College, Goa. More importantly, she has a decade of experience working in Afghanistan, and I think she's the best person we can host to talk about the issues that's happening in Afghanistan at the moment. Professor Shanthie, thank you so much for taking your time and being on the show. It's an honor and a privilege to host you.
Thank you for having me here. It's a good platform and nice to see bright and young students like you ask intelligent questions.
Well, I hope I can live up to the expectations of asking intelligent questions till the end.
And more importantly, talk about Afghanistan, because I think very soon everyone will forget what's happening in Afghanistan. So I think we have to keep our policy and academic attention alive in Afghanistan so that it doesn't go back to what it was in the 1990s.
So let's start with the first question I want to ask you is, we saw what happened 2 days back on 26th of August. The date of recording the interview is 28th August. So 2 days before, we saw a twin blast that happened around the airport, in the airport corridor, and we saw the ISKP took responsibility of the attack. And going back to Zabihullah Mujahid's press conference, where he mentioned that he won't be allowing any terrorist organization to operate from the soil of Afghanistan, we see a very different and stark image. While the Taliban might say that the ISKP is not in good terms with the Taliban either, it's against the Taliban. But how do you see what unfolding in Afghanistan at the moment and with the blast?
What we saw is very unfortunate, given the loss of life, especially Afghans who are trying to leave the country. And it was we already saw it as a humanitarian crisis. Now we see it as a huge security crisis as well. The fact is that Taliban capture of power in Kabul implied that a terrorist group with linkages to international terrorist groups has been emboldened. So if you look at Taliban, it has not snapped its linkages with Al-Qaeda. So the Taliban-Al-Qaeda linkages exist. Along with that, there are a lot of many international groups aligned with the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. So if you only think that Taliban is a nationalist movement, political organization which has captured power to bring peace in Afghanistan, that's really not true. So there has been indication of the ISKP presence in Afghanistan for some time now, and ISKP conducted this attack at the Kabul airport, and we're going to see many of these kind of attacks occurring. So how does it play to advantage of Taliban? One is, I think it helps Taliban consolidate its position to project an image of it not being a terrorist organization and putting blame on some other organization. And thirdly, it's also about the control this Taliban has with the ISKP. So are they going to fight out each other in Afghanistan? And in which case there would be an escalation of violence. And that's what we are going to see. So the fact that the Taliban has captured power doesn't mean it's end of violence or a beginning of peace in Afghanistan. There's going to be a lot more violence because there's terrorist groups which are existing in that country, and new terrorist groups which are going to find base in that country. It's going to be a hotbed of terrorism with these terrorist groups attacking each other and the Afghans and international community getting caught in between. And success of the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda combined in Afghanistan has emboldened many groups, just not inside the country, but also in the region. If you see the implications it's going to have in Southeast Asia, South Asia, Central Asia, Africa, and other theaters, I think this has just sent out a message that the terrorist group which can occupy power structures without any legitimacy and accountability is going to be a classic problem for the international community, especially when it's dealing with terrorist groups like this. So we're going to see a surge in violence in Afghanistan and also strengthening of the international terrorist groups and the fight among them playing out in theaters like this, and a replication of this in other theaters.
Among the dead, there were 28 Taliban members as well. And Taliban is playing the victim card here and condemning the attack. But looking at the ISKP, the group's rank had fallen to about 1,500 to 2,000 fighters, about half of its peak in 2016 before the American airstrikes and Afghan commando raids took a toll, killing many of its leaders. But having said that, the new commander, Shabab al-Mujahid, is trying to recruit the disaffected Taliban fighters and other militants. In fact, a lot of Taliban fighters have joined ISKP post-Taliban takeover. So how do you assess the strength of the group ISKP right now? And do you think they're capable of carrying out more attacks against the West?
Well, I think a lot of these Taliban cadres joined the ISKP because some of them were not happy with the peace processes and the peace agreement. Secondly, some of them actually want the implementation of the Sharia as an ideology. So there have been differences within the Taliban. So the fact that if you see the strengthening of ISKP, it's not in numbers, but in terms of its potential, it's increasing. Yeah. So ISKP, there is going to be difference playing out between the Taliban and ISKP, but it's going to play out in a way that will be worrisome for the region. And ISKP has the potential of developing and carrying out attacks. So I think that is one more area. But who is really the ISKP is a $1 million question, which I think we need to do further studies. The second is also the fact that Taliban is trying to play a victim card and project a very moderate and modern face to gain legitimacy and acceptability. So now it appears like Taliban, despite all its brutality and the capability of imposing this Islamic rule again, is seen as a good factor or a good Taliban, or vis-a-vis the ISKP who are the bad Taliban, and these differences are being played out. So that instability continues in Afghanistan, and peace and stability will remain elusive in that country.
And where do you see Al-Qaeda fitting among all these groups? As we have seen that it has changed substantially, as well as since Osama bin Laden oversaw the organization and spread his views. But right now we see the group is splintered, it's battered. In general, it did not maintain the same operational control over its affiliates as, for example, the Islamic State right now does. So tell us, where does the Al-Qaeda fits among all these? Is it still capable?
I think Al-Qaeda will remain a potent force, given that its affiliate, Taliban, has captured power. And that's definitely a sign of victory for Taliban. And the differences between Al-Qaeda and Taliban on one side and ISKP is going to play out. And that is going to play out in other theaters as well. So the fact that Al-Qaeda maintained its linkages, or the Taliban has continued, despite the fact that Al-Qaeda didn't have a clear leadership, but also the fact that Taliban has been able to make so much of advances, has strengthened the Al-Qaeda. And despite the peace agreement, which was signed between the United States and Taliban in February 2020, the Taliban had not really snapped the linkages with Al-Qaeda. And this has been obvious, even from the UN CT reports. So if you look at the counterterrorism measures per se, I don't think those linkages are broken. In terms of funding, I think they're still able to continue and sustain their funding sources, and thereby the potent attacks which are going to emerge from this group exist.
So during a press conference, when the US State Department spokesperson was asked about sharing information regarding the security of the Kabul airport with the Taliban and whether it was extended to the Haqqani Network as well, the spokesperson mentioned, and I quote, "The Taliban and Haqqani Network are two separate entities." Despite having this close links between the terrorist groups, Taliban and Haqqani Network, the US State Department didn't acknowledge them as together. So how do you see the situation? Because these two groups are together, right? Even, in fact, when the Taliban was taking over Kabul, there were Haqqani Network fighters as well who were closely linked or associated with the entire incident.
Well, it's interesting because if you look at the Taliban leadership structure, one of the Haqqani brothers is the deputy, right? So you have Jalaluddin Haqqani, who is the deputy chief of the Taliban. So I'm not sure why would anyone say there are no linkages between the two. Secondly, is that they have been hand in glove. So what you see in terms of delegation of security to the Haqqani network indicates that there is a linkage. So there's no snapping of linkages between the Taliban and Haqqani network. And Haqqani network remains a very virulent force and capable of carrying out many attacks. So separating the Taliban to make it appear good from the Haqqani or from the Al-Qaeda is not going to play out in the long run, because the fact on the ground is that those linkages are there, those connections are there, and they're going to continue their joint attacks.
Okay, so now let's come to the press conference by Zabihullah Mujahid, and I want to start with the issue of women's rights. It's a very important issue, and I thought let's start a conversation with this. When he was asked about whether it's committed to the rights of women, and he mentioned that the Islamic Emirate is committed to the rights of women, but within the framework of Sharia, right? And he said, and I quote, our women are Muslim. They will be happy to be living within our framework of Sharia. So according to you, who have studied Afghanistan closely and the Taliban over the years, how do you read the situation? What will be the role of women post the Taliban takeover in building the Afghan society? And how much do you think of this, what we saw in the 90s of what women had to go through when Taliban was ruling Afghanistan, of coming back in the present day?
Well, I think what the Taliban are trying to project from the press conference and media statements in Kabul is very different from what's happening in the provinces, particularly in terms of the women's rights, and that's worrisome. One is that they don't want to have resistance from any, women's group and women's movement in Kabul. So they're trying to send out this message that they will involve women in employment opportunities. They will open up sectors. They will let them work the way they used to do, all of that. But that again comes with a caveat, because I remember when I did an interview in 2011 in Kabul with Maulvi Kalamuddin, who was the deputy vice chief of the Taliban during the Taliban time in the 1990s and had surrendered and joined the Afghan government in 2011. I had asked him this question that if Taliban were to be in any of the power structures in Kabul or a surrendered force, would they be open to having women work, come and join the ministries, sit on a table with men across and have this discussion the way I was having with them? And he said yes. And this was the same person who in 1990s under the Taliban used to beat up women for wearing shoes, used to smash TV sets for people watching TVs, has forcefully asked men to grow beards, and has imposed the strict of Islamic laws. And in 2011, for tactical reasons, obviously he said that, yes, I'm open, because that doesn't indicate a transformational mindset. So what we're seeing from the statements of the Taliban leaders now in Kabul is to gain acceptance, one, within its society, because Afghanistan has changed from what it was. But that change has been limited to urban areas. So in urban areas, they're making this kind of statement saying we're open to working with women. We will have them as join us in different ministries. But if you see what they're doing in the provinces, it's a different story. They're actually beating up women, forcefully getting them to marry the foot soldiers. And we're also seeing an increase in human trafficking here, which is upgrade. So that is worrisome, and that is an indication of what the Taliban will be once they consolidate their position and capture power totally. So today they are in a position where they're still scrambling to put some order and semblance in terms of their governance, in terms of their international reputation and legitimacy, in terms of opposition which is still existing in the country. One is the women's right, and also the former vice president of Afghanistan, who is there as a caretaker president. So just to quell that opposition and gain legitimacy and get funding from international community, they are trying to project this image. But also the fact that we don't know what positions women will be offered. Because I remember a couple of years back when they had a discussion of this sort, when President Ghani was trying to make an outreach, they were open to women having every position except as a chief justice or a chief of the army or the president of the country. So they might give certain leeway in terms of giving them some position, but that doesn't mean that they let women represent the way women are representing Afghanistan now. So how many of them will actually be able to come back to the parliament, given that women had significant numbers in terms of the parliament representation? How many of them can continue as provincial councillors and carry out the work in the provinces? And I think herein there is a disconnect, because even if they take in women, it could be just symbolic and did not mean a transformational or structural change in terms of protecting the women's rights or giving some scope for women to perform their duties. So I think we have to take it with a pinch of salt and caution. because what they're projecting, if you're going to be led by that, it could just end up having just a segment of women who are given those privileges, and the rest of the women are subjected to that brutality.
So this brings me to two questions actually. One, how do you see Taliban has actually matured over the years? In the context, how do you see they have become media savvy of how they present their views, staying a little neutral, not going too controversial? That's one. And the second thing I want to ask you is if you've seen the reports that they have asked women to stay indoors until there's a certain sense of peace that prevails on ground. Looking at before the pre-Taliban takeover, where there was Taliban influence in certain rural parts, there were hardly any women seen on streets, and the women were asked to go out only when they are accompanied by a man. So do you think this takeover period where they're asking there's a smooth transition of power, they want women to stay indoors, it's just larger connotation of how situation might look like post the Taliban takeover?
Right. So in terms of, I mean, I don't think that's the right question, but I think more in terms of how Taliban has transformed itself, right, from what it was, and how it's trying to use the media to project a different image of it. And in both counts, I think it's happened in the sense what you see in 1990s Taliban movement, it's not a monolithic movement anymore. Right from 2001, from when it was vanquished from the seats of power in Kabul, to 2020, you see that Taliban has transformed itself in many ways. Okay, and you also see the fact that Taliban is not doesn't have that leadership structure, because you don't know where's the Emir at the moment, Habibullah. And you don't know how Baradar is actually representing the Taliban, because he was the one who was more into the peace processes and peace agreement with the United States. So Taliban is a transformed entity. It's not a monolithic organization. There's no spiritual control of the supreme leader like what Mullah Omar had. And the fact that there are various different divisions and linkages with international terrorist groups makes it a different entity. So it has connections with Al-Qaeda, it has connections with Gulbuddin Hekmat Hizb Islami, the Haqqani Network, the tribal fighters in these provinces, smugglers. So there's a whole war economy in place here along with the movement. So Taliban is not an organization which has a structured form, and there are divisions within it. So that makes it an interesting area of study. The second is in terms of women's rights. I think we have to understand that Afghanistan has gone through a lot of transformation, and women have taken a greater role. So if you look at women's per se, I think we're looking at a different connotation. But more importantly, if you look at Taliban in terms of the changes it has made in terms of strategic communications, I think it has been far more advanced than the Afghan government and of the international community. Right through its advances from 2005 and 6 onwards, it has adopted a very interesting and useful media strategy. One is it had its night letters and radio messages going out in the provinces in the rural areas. Secondly, it started using social media, and it used it very well. And then it used the international media, because international media covered Taliban attacks more than Afghan government forces achievements in Afghanistan. So in a way, it worked to the advantage of strategic advantage of Taliban, that they're able to create havoc, destroy so much of territory, and cause so much of violence, that it worked to the advantage of the Taliban clearly in terms of the international media's reporting of Afghanistan, particularly the negative stories coming there. And now, since it's come out to occupy and have some kind of governance in Afghanistan, is trying to project again a very moderate face. All this kind of images of saying that it's going to work with women's right groups, it's going to make reach out to a lot of countries in the region. And those kind of messages are actually making them look like a more modern and amenable force.
So one aspect I believe that has not been spoken about a lot is how the media will function post the Taliban takeover. Especially, we have seen repeated number of attacks being carried out on journalists, even though when the peace negotiations were being carried out with the Afghan government and the Taliban. And when this question was asked to Zabihullah Mujahid, he replied saying that he assures the media that they're committed to work in the cultural frameworks, which is a very important term. And he mentions that they has to operate in Islamic values and Afghans' national values, national unity, and national consensus. So, how do you read the situation on the media? You might have contacts out there who work in the media. So, how do you see the media operating post the Taliban takeover, and how do they get guaranteed of their safety if they report something which is against what the national consensus they refer to?
I think in terms of media, there was a huge explosion in terms of the number of media outlets and the fact that media was able to make a lot of impact in the initial years in Afghanistan, initial years of the intervention. But later on, that space started being restricted. There were considerable media blackouts, so actually you didn't get clear image of the number of casualties, the number of Afghan forces and international forces were killed. So gradually the nature of the media started changing when there were controls being imposed, blackouts being occurred. But now with the Taliban, it's a different game altogether. If you look at what they say in terms, both in terms of women's rights, when they say that women can have the rights, but within the Islamic system, and same with the media. So what does the Islamic system mean? I mean, you can't question authority in that sense. You can't question the leadership. And you can't write anything which is against the cultural values. And cultural values defined by whom? By the Afghans or by the Taliban? And again, within the Taliban, if you look at it as a nationalist force, as a local force, it's not so. It has linkages with Al-Qaeda, which has the Wahhabi Saudi virulent ideology, which is opposed by the Afghans. So over time, there might be media reportings which on this kind of scenarios where, the journalists don't have the freedom to actually report. And that's going to be a huge problem because gradually we see that shrinking of that space available for the media persons. And as my interactions with media and my contacts, I think there's a lot of concern about it, especially among the women. And women have been reporting a lot from the provinces. In one province I had visited, that's Badakhshan, there were a lot of women working in radio stations. And now they're afraid to go out and work. And unfortunately, this situation actually had started to turn right in 2015 and 16, when international community had stopped funding these radio stations. And they were not getting money. And still they sustained based on their own income and their own interests. And given the fact that Taliban will not let them do what they actually want to report, it'll be a sad commentary of affairs and a huge implication in terms of loss of human rights and women's rights.
Yeah, and another aspect is the role of civil society that has been there in Afghanistan. Especially we have seen the Bonn Agreement going for a toss right now, and a new Bonn Agreement 2.0 coming into the picture of whether having within the frameworks of Sharia again. So how do you see the role of civil society being developed to actually come to a consensus, to have certain amount of Taliban taking at least a little bit consensus from the civil society? Do you see any picture of having a little Taliban civil society conversation while framing the Bonn Agreement 2.0, or it's just Taliban's idea of what they want to impose?
Well, I think that's an important question and a difficult one as well, because for my studies on the civil society organization of Afghanistan, there existed a lot, many, but most of them were scattered and they were not unified. So they're very ambiguous, they're not a consolidated entity. So you don't have a uniform voice coming out from the civil society organization. So how civil society groups function in the north, in Mazar-e-Sharif, or in the Badakhshan is very different from how civil society functioned in Kandahar or Helmand. And unfortunately, international community did not build that linkages between the groups and have that platform, where today you might have had civil society groups protesting and coming out and trying to engage the Taliban so that they moderate their, Islamist and virulent ideology. But that again hasn't occurred. So there is a potential, there is availability of this group still existing within Afghanistan. But it's about how do you reach out to them and how do you make sure that there's a dialogue going on between the Taliban and the civil society groups. And even if that occurs, given the fact that Taliban has actually captured power without any opposition, has consolidated its position in such a way that it's seen as a victor dictating terms to the others. And that's going to play out in the near term very soon. It's just that what they're trying to do now is to get a hold of the situation, consolidate their position, right from the attacks in the airport to what is happening with the outreach with the opposition, trying to kind of quell the resistance in its own way in the provinces and in the urban centers. So we can't go by this images shown by the Taliban. And unfortunately, groups like the women's groups and the civil society groups which exist have not been unified to an extent or given that platform that they can have a dialogue with the Taliban. And I think it's for the international community to reach out to this kind of groups who are at great risk and who have taken great risks to do the kind of work they do, to protect them and give them that leverage with the Taliban.
The last point that I want to cover from Zabihullah Mujahid before I go to cover India's relation with Afghanistan post-Taliban takeover. One of the important things that came up was narcotics. And on one of the questions when asked whether Taliban will be controlling the heroin trade that has been continuing. And he mentioned that a very interesting thing in 2001, he said the narcotics content production was zero. And unfortunately, then when the government came over, it increased. But looking at the economy of Afghanistan, it is mostly aid dependent. It comes from international community. And Taliban's major economy has been based on narcotics production. Do you see by any chance this Taliban not using this to actually get the money, or completely dependent on international community, provided that there's a government, international government still in operating?
Well, I think if you remember what happened in 2001 and the Taliban projection that they had brought down the drug production to zero, it was more in a function of the drought at that time rather than the Taliban imposition or curtailing. Taliban has always depended on the drug money, the narco trade, and it will continue to do so. So if you see from 2007 onwards, the rise in the narcotic production in Afghanistan, given that Afghans didn't have any other opportunity in terms of revenue generation or income generating schemes, and they went back to poppy production because one, it was lucrative, and secondly, it was the fact that they didn't get the money they needed. So they depended on this kind of trade. And that went to the Taliban coffers as well and funded the insurgency then. So if Taliban doesn't get any kind of funding from the international community, it's definitely going to rely on the drugs, and there's no doubt about that. In addition to that, there's a complete political economy of conflict in place in terms of smugglers, human trafficking, mineral resources. Taliban were already extracting a huge revenue from the mineral resources in Afghanistan, even during the previous government's time. So all of this makes it like dependent on, not more dependent on international community. And so if you don't build in that leverages of restricting their kind of ideology now, they will go back to drug trades and other sources of income, and they'll be able to sustain themselves. So it is worrisome that Afghanistan's drug trade, which has already increased, is going to spiral out of control, and that will create more problems, just not for Afghanistan, but also for the region and for the West.
I wanted to talk a little bit about India's role in Afghanistan, especially post-Taliban takeover. And since we have seen India being a huge helping hand, especially with development projects over the few years, a lot of conversation has happened that India should have played it more smartly. They should have been in touch with Taliban. They should have not been they should not just have held the moral ground by just talking to the Afghan government, but also through some Taliban faction. Since Taliban was more factionated than ever, they should have played on that. What's your sense of India's role post-Taliban takeover, and did India play its cards right?
Okay, interesting question about India playing its cards right. I think if you look at India's role in Afghanistan from 2001 till now, it's basically supported the Afghan government, and it's gone by this symbolic terms of Afghan-led, Afghan-owned, Afghan-controlled processes, when actually it wasn't Afghan-led or owned or controlled, especially when you look at the peace processes. So I think from 2014 till now, when India knew that there was a rapid change occurring inside Afghanistan in the shifting sands of time, it should have made its calculations that, it cannot continue under the US security umbrella because the Americans are going to leave someday, and they'll leave it in whatever form and mess it is, and India will be left to pick up the mess. And that's exactly where we are today. So if you look at India's role, in terms of its engagement with Afghanistan over the last 2 decades, it's been very positive. It has pledged more than $3 billion US. It's the largest regional donor, and it has accrued tremendous amount of goodwill. But what India really didn't do is in terms of institution building, where India could have seen that the money which India provided went into building institutions which would have sustained the changes of time, or security sector and the political sector, in the economics, especially in terms of development. So India did a lot of projects, a lot of capacity building projects, a lot of infrastructure development projects, which were useful. But now with the change in regime and the Taliban takeover, you don't know what happens to these projects. How do you sustain them? So you have India needed to maintain a policy of, while supporting to the Afghan government meant this not symbolic support, but building the institutions inside the Afghan government that would have withstood this kind of an onslaught. In terms of the security, in terms of Taliban making advances, and also the capture of power. So given that that didn't occur, and now India is left with a situation where there's Taliban in control of Kabul, India will have to go for a certain level of engagement. So, but I would beg to differ that India should have done this before, in the sense of recognizing or engaging the Taliban, because then you would be undermining the Afghan government whom you are trying to work with and build. So that would have been counterproductive. But when you knew that things are changing and the Taliban are making, sending those feelers of, engaging you, certain level of engagement would have been useful. And not because you wanted to have a parallel track across with or against Afghan government, but more to see whether these kind of forces could be brought into the Afghan society and Afghan government. And then India could have had a larger role with these groups. And why am I saying that? Is because India had a broad appeal across all the ethnic groups. So unlike what India was in the 1990s, with its influence hugely with the northern groups like the Tajiks and Uzbeks and the Hazaras, India had inculcated a lot in terms of the Pashtun areas as well. And there was a lot of support within the Pashtun areas. And because of the support in Pashtun areas, the Taliban had grudgingly acceded to the fact that India's development assistance is good for the Afghans, and they send those kind of engagements. So they were basically foot soldiers, provincial commanders, and that kind of engagement would have helped India to consolidate that kind of projects which are working in these areas and see that they are sustained over time. But I don't think India did that. But here, when you're looking at moral ground, I think I have a different opinion. I mean, I don't think India, uses any moral high ground when it deals with policies in the region. If you look at how India has worked with the military in Myanmar, the Maoists in Nepal, the military dictatorships in Pakistan, it's not that India has upheld democracy in its ways and forms. But what India was trying to do was to protect a regime which is friendly towards India. But what India didn't see is that the changes which were occurring inside Afghanistan and the region, which was against this regime, which is gradually building up. Inside Afghanistan, there was so much of opposition building up to President Ghani, right from that fraud-mar elections in 2014, where I was the election observer. And the disunity among them was actually helping the regional powers to get greater foothold inside Afghanistan. We didn't perceive that. We didn't do anything in that point of time. And given the fact that India had that kind of appeal across a lot of these ethnic groups, and it could have played a large role as a facilitator, enabler to bring about unity inside Afghanistan. We gifted Afghans a huge flag, a big flag, about which I've written about, and it's flying on the in Wazir Akbar Khan area, where you can see it from any part of Kabul, and it was a great sign of pride and unity among Afghans. And now the flag will come down very soon, and that's very unfortunate both for the Afghans and Indians, because what we try to do is to work on symbols. So give them the flag, we give them the parliament, we give them the dam, we give this, but how do you see that and make sure the Afghans are able to use it the way they should? So it's one thing to say that most of the projects are based on Afghan needs and priorities, and thereby there's ownership. But today, we don't know where is the ownership and what happens to the needs of the Afghans. How do you sustain these projects over time when things change dramatically? So I think the initial policy of supporting the Afghan government was good. There was a lot of work done inside Afghanistan, which helped many groups, especially women's groups, even in places like Herat and Kandahar, where I personally met them. But what we didn't do is to actually have an integrated policy or integrated business plan where we link all these projects and give access to the Afghans in terms of markets so that they can have their own trade mechanisms, uh, more chambers of commerce, more in terms of revenue generation for that country. And what we saw was that Afghanistan continued depending on aid and couldn't generate considerable revenue inside its country. That worked to the disadvantage of the Afghans because with all that international aid dependence, they couldn't be independent in many ways. So I think India invested hugely and it had tremendous goodwill. The challenge was always to translate that goodwill into tangible outcomes. And we did see that what occurred in terms of the Taliban takeover. So having said that, there is leverage for India inside Afghanistan as someone who has broad-based appeal across all ethnic groups and can play a role as a facilitator. Even now, when Taliban is making this overtures towards inclusive government, probably India can play a role in that in terms of moderating their ideology, working with the opposition leaders like Karzai and Abdullah to see how they can have a kind of inclusive government where the Taliban is not in predominance. And there are certain constraints in what it can impose in terms of its strict Islamic laws. And the second thing is that there is an opposition inside Afghanistan, which is building up from the women's group and civil society groups. I think India should reach out to them, not just because you want an opposition, but also the fact that there's a humanitarian crisis and these people need help. So India should move on that. And thirdly, the legitimate leader of Afghanistan, that is Vice President Saleh, who is now the caretaker president, along with Ahmed Shah Massoud's son, Massoud, is in Panjshir, and they are opposing the Taliban takeover and resisting it. So I think India should look at all these options very carefully and see how it can use its leverages and goodwill so that it maintains its hold in the region. And lastly, but most importantly, I think the fact that even those Afghans who are trying to leave the country are not able to do so because of the change in the visa policies. And now that the visas have been cancelled and have been asked to apply for e-visas, making it very difficult for them to come to India, I think is not a step in the right direction. Because if we do that, we lose them forever. And one such incident was an MP who came to Delhi and was turned back and asked to go back to Istanbul from where she came. And she has sent out statements which clearly doesn't reflect well on India. She had a diplomatic passport from Afghanistan, and India still sent her back. So I think these are areas where India should avoid making this kind of mistakes because it's taken a lot of time and effort and blood and treasure of Indians to get that goodwill. A lot of ambassadors have done a lot of good work. A lot of the embassy had been targeted. Indian consulates have been constantly targeted. In very difficult circumstances, the diplomats and the embassy people have worked to build that goodwill. If you keep doing this inside Afghanistan, then you lose that goodwill and make it very difficult for you to operate in that country. So whatever contact and leverage you have in Afghanistan, India will gradually lose that. So whatever it does in terms of its visa policy, resettlement, repatriation, and also reaching out to those vulnerable groups in Afghanistan, I think that will be important in how India takes its leverages forward. And lastly, I think India can also play an important role in UN Security Council and also among the democratic countries to see that the democratic gains of the last 2 decades are retained. And therein, I think some kind of support to the democratic government, which is now under Vice President Saleh, that is a very important area where India should invest.
Yeah, and since you brought this important aspect of actually Amrullah Saleh as an caretaker president at the moment, how do you see the government formation in case the Taliban forms a government with a brother as one of the, if not the leader out there, but at least one of the major leaders in the game? Uh, how will that function? Because it's an international recognized government operating might be from Panjshir, one of the small districts out there, but it's still a government in function, international recognized government, and there might be another government of Taliban who might work with some other factions as well. So how do you see that?
Well, I think it will be an interesting scenario and a case study for international law, but more importantly about international community's role, because here you have a legitimate vice president who's taken on the role of a caretaker president under the Afghan constitution, which international community had recognized. And they can't give up on this kind of a person or personality or government at this point of time, because if they do, then the leverages they have against the Taliban are simply lost. Now, Taliban has made a lot of outreach to other leaders, but then it doesn't mean that Amrullah Saleh will join them in some form. I think he's opposed to the idea of Taliban because he knows what the Taliban are, and he has reasons for that. So others who are jockeying for power and influence, like Karzai and Abdullah and Hekmatyar, will gradually realize what the Taliban is, and then there will always be disunity inside Kabul. And disunity inside Kabul would mean political instability and violence, which will work to the advantage of other neighboring countries.
And this is interesting aspect that I found out that the UN estimates there will be around 5 lakh more refugees post Taliban takeover. And I heard from one of these Pakistan generals who commented that Pakistan gets take more Afghan refugees than India does. So Pakistan have a more say in Afghanistan policies than India in the first place. So how do you see Pakistan's role post Taliban takeover?
Well, I think I'll start with your last point about Pakistan takes more refugees than India. Well, that's true because Pakistan creates a situation where they have refugees and India doesn't. So that's the difference. And India also was involved in a project where they were building houses for the refugees in Pakistan, from Pakistan in India. The Afghan refugees who were in Pakistan, they were trying to get them back into Afghanistan through a housing project. So that was a project. So that's a difference, right? So Pakistan creates a situation where it leads to a refugee situation, and they go into Pakistan, and then Pakistan again gets international assistance for having refugees inside their country. India, on the other hand, works inside Afghanistan in building houses for those refugees to come back and live in Afghanistan. So this is a contrast, I would say, about how India and Pakistan deals and looks at refugees. So India is not interested in creating a situation where they are refugees and then getting them to India, but it's was interested in having projects for them inside Afghanistan so that they come from these neighboring countries back into Afghanistan. So having said that, Pakistan has always wanted to maintain influence and leverage inside Afghanistan right from the 70s. If you look at what happened during the early years of Soviet intervention, where Zia actually welcomed the Islamist parties and funded and nurtured them, he found an opportune moment of gaining strategic depth against India, and that rationale led him to keep funding these movements. And when Taliban actually made advances and captured power in Kabul in 1996, they thought that they had their boys in Kabul and things would work to their advantage. It didn't, because one is that Taliban never recognized the Durand line, and being the fact that they're Pashtuns, they will never recognize the Durand line. So this question of Pashtun nationalism and identityism always remained with the Pakistanis, and they were concerned about that. The second was they also thought that with Taliban back in power, they would have access to Central Asia trade, they would have security. Even that didn't work. And they, at various point of time, when Pakistan actually told them not to do things which were not favorable, the Taliban did not listen to the Pakistanis. So now we have a situation where I don't see that Pakistan wants a very strong and Taliban back in Kabul and a complete takeover of power by the Taliban, because that will be difficult for Pakistan to deal with. So they maintained certain strings. So they've ensured that certain segment of the Taliban under Mullah Baradar, who are out for the peace process, come back to Kabul. The emir of the Taliban movement is somebody else, maybe inside Pakistan, dead or alive, which we're not sure. So in that way, they have strings within the Taliban movement which they've controlled. And in addition to that, they have made outreach to a lot of opposition groups, including the former Northern Alliance leaders. And Abdullah is one of them, but Atanur, Ismail Khan, and all of that. So in a way, they've seen that the outreach towards the opposition and bridging of the gap between the Taliban and the Northern Alliance leaders leads to some kind of a governance in which Pakistan has some strings with all of these leaders. And the disunity which will be evident among them will work to the advantage of Taliban and to Pakistan by way of, ensuring that the disunity continues and there is a weak and unstable state in Afghanistan. So that's what Pakistan is looking at. Secondly, also concerned that a complete capture by Taliban would also embolden the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, TTP. And there are huge concerns of a blowback from this. So they are trying to work out a situation where, they have a weak state in Afghanistan, and Taliban are not united in a way that they will oppose Pakistan someday. So this is my sense of how they're working with the Taliban in Afghanistan, and also trying to make sure that they don't have a case where they have to deal with their own Taliban hitting them at their cities.
So I can't resist but asking this question since you mentioned about the Pashtun nationalism. And Pashtun nationalism is a very fair representation even on the national forums with leaders like Moshinder, Ali Wazir, and the main man being Mansoor Pashtun. Why does the Islamabad Pindi nexus get threatened by these PTM leaders in the first place?
They do, because if there is going to be a Pashtunistan form, it would have implications for the rest of Pakistan, because everyone could break down on its own ethnic identity lines and could lead to balkanization of Pakistan. And Pashtun areas are one in which the nationalist sentiment is very strong. And my visit to areas inside KPK in Pakistan also indicated the fact that they wanted a separate entity and identity. And they also feel that India let them down by not actually going ahead with what Frontier Gandhi wanted, so with the two-nation theory and all of that. So there is a historical baggage where they felt that they're always independent and would have remained so. India did not take up that role. And Pakistan is seriously worried, because if these two tribes, the Pashtun tribe comes together from these two countries, then it would lead to balkanization of Pakistan. And so during this period between 2014 and 2021, they went ahead and fenced the border, the Durand line, so that they could have some control over that territory, which was actually lawless in not many ways. And had this tribe united in such a way that the affinity was so strong between the tribes and the ethnic group that Taliban were seen as part of them. So Pakistan has moved ahead in terms of doing this fencing and recognizing the Durand line. Afghanistan hasn't, and Afghanistan won't. And the fear of that formation of Pashtunistan is huge among Pakistanis, especially the military establishment.
So the last question before I let you go is on the US. So I don't know where to start about this, but Taliban said they won't be extending the deadline for the evacuation post August 31st. And then we see a close call up with the CIA chief calling up Nani brother, and they spoke. How do you see US relation with Taliban post this? Will there be intelligence sharing? Will there be a close network where they will work? Because US still might be leaving, but are very skeptical of Taliban, and they wanted a counterterrorism base in Pakistan, which Imran Khan said he won't provide, and later on he did that, like every other policies. But the major policies, do you see a very weak president, a very weak Joe Biden out there, not being able to act upon his wishes, succumb by the pressure? And my last point is, every wounds take a time to heal. How long will US take time to heal the Afghanistan wound?
Okay, all interesting and important questions, but I don't see President Biden as weak, because the decision he made and he stuck by it in terms of withdrawal, in terms of even the humanitarian crisis unfolding, and more importantly, without evacuation plans, actually shows that he's taken a decision and he's standing by it. So as America is looking inward and trying to get more, trying to build its own home ground, it will limit itself in terms of external interventions until the time they're forced to actually intervene. And we see that situation developing in Afghanistan. So one thing one is not sure is about the secret annexes which existed between the US and Taliban in the peace agreement of 2020, of whether they'll have any kind of information sharing, intelligence sharing. But having said that, even talking about secret annexes with the Taliban is almost like talking to the Al-Qaeda, because the linkages exist and they work in a symbiotic relationship. So I'm not sure of how the US would function given the way they're exiting now, which is almost a repeat of what we saw in Saigon after the Vietnam War. And it's a very sad image to see a global superpower retreat the way it is. And the gap they're leaving behind is being filled just not by China and Pakistan, but also by these terrorist groups. And this is something I think which will really hit the international community in ways we are not prepared for, because we did have the strikes which occurred on 9/11, but there will be different ways by which these groups will operate and carry out strikes. And more importantly, the message the Americans have left to the people of Afghanistan in the region as a partner, as a friend, as someone you could trust, I think that's been taken a beating. So I would see this as the biggest foreign policy disaster for the Biden administration.
Yeah, and just a small thing that I want to ask you is, like especially people in terrorism studies, we believe that image plays a very important role in how recruitment or radicalization takes place. What happened in Afghanistan and the US leaving, literally running away, especially from the Bagram air base, is getting scared. Does this project a very negative image which will lead to more radicalization, more people coming and joining the ISIS?
I think it definitely would be, because it's seen as a sign of victory against a superpower who was actually seen leaving the way it did in not so positive ways. It could have been done differently. Secondly, is also the fact that you have the terrorists occupying your power structures. It will encourage others. And thirdly, it will lead to radicalization, because the influence and the positive images coming from this group's controlling territory will have implications in terms of the radicalization which is occurring.
Yeah. Well, I won't ask you any more questions, though I have a lot of them, but that's for some time else. But thank you so much for taking your time and being on the show. It's an honor and a privilege to host you.
Thank you, Ratnadeep.